For 3 years, Kang Min-Jae hadn't flinched at the sight of blood. Enemies, traitors, threats, they all blurred into shadows he erased without a second thought. His soldiers had a name for him, the Ghost of Wall Street. Some whispered he felt no pain. Others said his soul died the night he took his first life for the family. Everyone agreed on one thing: Kang Min-Jae would never be saved. But on a random Thursday night, in the marble halls of the Grand Regency Hotel, he'd collapsed against a service elevator, bleeding out from 3 bullet wounds. The rival faction's ambush had been perfect. His men were dead. He was alone. And he was dying. Then she appeared. "If you die here, I have to clean it up." Petra Thompson stood over him in her maid's uniform, her dark skin glistening with the effort of a double shift, her eyes sharp with something he'd never seen before, practicality mixed with defiance. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She grabbed his arm with surprising strength and hissed, "Follow me." One choice. That's all it took for 3 years of ghosts to become flesh again. She didn't know who he was. She didn't care about his legend. And that made him realize he wanted to live. Please subscribe to Soul Woven Stories and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Now, let's continue. Petra Thompson had exactly $287 in her savings account, a phone with a cracked screen held together by duct tape, and a work ethic that wouldn't let her accept anyone's pity. "Housekeeping," she called out, knocking on room 1847 of the Grand Regency. It was 11 p.m., the end of another brutal double shift. Her feet ached in her regulation flats. Her shoulders burned from hauling industrial vacuum cleaners up and down the staff stairwells management wouldn't bother to fix. She didn't complain. Every shift she completed meant $18.50 an hour, just enough to chip away at the mountain of debt her mother's cancer treatment had left behind. At 26, this wasn't where she thought she'd be. 3 years ago, she'd been 6 months away from finishing her nursing degree. Then the diagnosis came. Stage 4. Petra dropped out, worked every hour God sent, and still watched her mother fade away in a hospital bed that cost more per day than Petra made in a week. Now she was alone in New York, exhausted and invisible, but too damn stubborn to break. She had just turned down the dimly lit service corridor toward the freight elevator when she heard it, the sharp crack of gunfire, muffled but unmistakable, echoing through the marble and brass like thunder trapped indoors. Petra froze. Then she heard the second sound, heavy footsteps running, getting closer. Her survival instinct screamed at her to hide. But Petra Thompson had learned long ago that hiding didn't pay the rent. She pressed herself against the wall and waited to see what kind of trouble was about to ruin her night. Petra's apartment was a 5th-floor walk-up in Washington Heights that smelled like the Korean restaurant downstairs and had water stains on the ceiling that looked like a map of nowhere good. She'd half-carried, half-dragged Kang Min-Jae up those stairs, his blood leaving a trail she'd have to scrub before Mrs. Chin saw it in the morning. "Sit," she ordered, shoving him onto her second-hand futon. Kang obeyed, which surprised them both. Men like him didn't take orders. Men like him gave them, usually at gunpoint. But the blood loss had made him lightheaded, and something about this woman's voice carried the kind of authority that didn't need a weapon behind it. She disappeared into the bathroom and returned with a first aid kit that looked like it had seen better days. Her hands were steady as she cut away his shirt with kitchen scissors, exposing the tattoos that crawled across his chest and shoulders like smoke given form. Dragons. Tigers. Symbols in Korean script he knew she couldn't read. "You do this often?" he asked, his voice rough. "Play nurse to dying strangers?" "My mother had cancer," Petra said flatly, threading a curved needle she'd sterilized over her stove. "I learned to do a lot of things I never wanted to learn." She didn't ask permission. She just pushed the needle through his skin, pulling the wound closed with practiced efficiency. Kang watched her face instead of his own flesh. She bit her lower lip when she concentrated. A small crease formed between her eyebrows. She wasn't gentle, but she wasn't careless either. "You're not afraid of me," he observed. "Should I be?" "Most people are." Petra tied off the stitch and reached for the antiseptic. Most people didn't just save your life. That buys me at least 24 hours of not being murdered in my own apartment, right? The corner of his mouth twitched. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was something. 48, he said. I'm generous. She snorted and started on the second wound, the one near his ribs. This one was deeper. Her jaw tightened as she worked, fingers moving with the kind of muscle memory that came from too many nights in hospital rooms, watching nurses work while insurance companies decided whether her mother's pain was worth paying for. Why didn't you run? Kang asked quietly. When you saw me bleeding. You could have walked away. Petra met his eyes for the first time since she'd started stitching. Hers were dark brown, almost black in the dim light of her apartment, and completely unafraid. Because, she said, I'm tired of watching people die when I could do something about it. Kang Min-Jae had killed 17 men in his lifetime. He'd inherited an empire built on fear and blood. He'd never once questioned whether his life had value beyond what it could take from others. But in that moment, watching a broke hotel maid stitch him back together in an apartment barely bigger than his closet, he wondered if maybe he'd been asking the wrong question all along. They came at dawn, 3 black SUVs rolling up to the crumbling building like a funeral procession. Petra was awake, had been for hours, watching Kang sleep on her futon while she kept vigil from her kitchen chair. He'd passed out around 3 a.m., fever finally breaking, his breathing steady enough that she'd allowed herself to relax. The knock on her door wasn't a request. It was a warning that came half a second before the lock picked itself and 4 men in expensive suits flooded her tiny apartment. Boss, the first one said, dropping to one knee beside the futon like he'd found a fallen king. Kang's eyes snapped open, instantly alert despite the blood loss. Status: 3 dead at the hotel. The Black Sun claimed responsibility. They've gone underground, but we're tracking. The man's eyes cut to Petra, who'd stood up and grabbed the kitchen knife she'd used to cut Kang's shirt. It wasn't much, but it was something. Who's the girl? The girl has a name, Petra snapped. And you're in her apartment, so maybe start with an apology for breaking her lock. One of the men actually smiled. Another looked at her like she'd just signed her death warrant. The one who'd spoken first just looked at Kang, waiting for permission to either escort her out or put a bullet in her head. Kang sat up slowly, wincing as the stitches pulled. She saved my life. The temperature in the room shifted. The men exchanged glances. Saving the boss's life meant something in their world. It meant debt. It meant obligation. It meant Petra Thompson had just become a very complicated problem. Then she's seen too much, the first man said carefully. Sir, protocol demands. I know what protocol demands. Kang stood, steadier than he should have been. He crossed to Petra in 3 steps and took the knife from her hand before she could process what was happening. Pack a bag. You have 5 minutes. Excuse me? The Black Sun knows I survived. They'll backtrack my movements, find the hotel surveillance, see you helping me. His voice was matter-of-fact, like he was explaining basic arithmetic. They'll assume you're valuable to me, which means they'll use you as leverage. So you have 2 choices, come with me voluntarily, or I carry you out. Either way, you're leaving this apartment. Petra stared at him. At the man she'd stitched back together, who was now standing in her kitchen like he owned it, surrounded by armed soldiers, telling her she was being kidnapped for her own protection. I have work, she said stupidly. My shift starts at 3. You're unemployed as of now. I'll compensate the loss. Kang gestured to one of his men. 4 minutes. Petra looked around her apartment. The water-stained ceiling. The futon still marked with his blood. The life she'd barely been holding together with duct tape and stubbornness. She grabbed her backpack and started shoving clothes inside. 3 minutes, Kang said, almost gently. Kang's mansion in Riverdale looked like something out of a crime movie, all floor-to-ceiling windows and modern architecture that screamed new money trying to look legitimate. Petra stood in the marble foyer, backpack slung over one shoulder, and counted 6 security cameras before she stopped trying. The guest suite is on the 3rd floor, Kang said, gesturing toward a staircase that probably cost more than her entire building. My men will be stationed outside your door. For your safety. So I'm a prisoner. You're protected. Same thing with better marketing. Petra dropped her backpack and looked around. The foyer alone was bigger than her apartment. It was also a disaster. Mail piled on a console table that probably cost 10 grand. Takeout containers scattered across the kitchen island visible through an archway. Expensive furniture covered in a thin layer of dust that meant the cleaning service hadn't been by in weeks. She turned back to Kang, who was watching her with that unreadable expression he wore like armor. You live like this? Like what? Like a bunch of dangerous men playing house. She walked past him into the kitchen, taking inventory. Dishes in the sink. Whiskey bottles lined up like soldiers. A refrigerator that probably contained nothing but beer and expired takeout. Where's your staff? I don't trust civilians in my home. But you trust me? Kang's jaw tightened. That's different. Because I saved your life, which means I'm stuck here until your gang war is over, which means you're stuck with me. Petra opened a cabinet and found exactly what she expected, matching plates that had never been used and plastic forks from delivery orders. So here's how this works. I'm not sitting in a guest room like some princess in a tower. I'll earn my keep. You don't need to. I need to do something or I'll lose my mind. She turned to face him, hands on her hips. You want me safe? Fine. But I'm not a guest. I'm not your responsibility. I'm going to run this house like it should be run, and you're going to let me, because right now it looks like a crime scene. One of Kang's men appeared in the doorway, clearly having overheard. He looked at his boss, waiting for the explosion. Nobody talked to Kang Min-Jae like that. Nobody gave him orders in his own home. Kang stared at Petra for a long moment. Then he did something his men had rarely seen, he almost smiled. The household account password is on the desk in my office. Security code for the gates is 0624. You'll need both to order supplies. He turned to leave, then paused. Try not to reorganize my weapons closet. That's where I draw the line. You have a weapons closet? 3rd floor. Next to your guest suite. Petra watched him walk away, his men trailing behind like confused shadows. She looked around the kitchen and cracked her knuckles. Time to get to work. 3 weeks into her captivity/employment, Petra had transformed Kang's mansion into something that almost resembled a home. The mail was sorted. The kitchen actually functioned. His men had stopped ordering takeout every night because she cooked meals that reminded them they were still human under all the expensive suits and shoulder holsters. She found Kang in his study at midnight, shirt off, examining the healing wounds she'd stitched. The scar tissue was pink and raised, her uneven stitching creating a pattern that would mark him forever. I should have done better, she said from the doorway. If I'd had proper supplies. It's perfect. He didn't turn around. It reminds me. Of what? Almost dying? Of why I didn't. Petra stepped into the room, drawn by something she didn't want to name. He was standing by the window, moonlight cutting across the tattoos that covered his back and shoulders. She'd seen them before, when she'd stitched him up, but she'd been too focused on keeping him alive to really look. Now she looked. What do they mean? She asked quietly. All that ink. Kang glanced back at her, then gestured to his left shoulder where a tiger prowled through flames. This one I got when I made my first kill. I was 17. My father said I'd earned the right to wear the family mark. Petra moved closer, close enough to see the details. The tiger's eyes were rendered in striking detail, fierce and beautiful and sad all at once. This one, he touched his ribs, where a dragon coiled around Korean script, was for my father's funeral. The words say, duty is heavier than death. That's a terrible thing to carry on your body. It's the only thing that kept me alive. He turned to face her fully, and she saw the rest of them, the symbols and characters and creatures that turned his skin into a story written in permanent ink. Every mark is a moment I survived. Every image is a person I lost. Petra reached out before she could stop herself, her fingertips brushing the raised scar tissue where she'd stitched him back together. The wound cut through part of the dragon, disrupting the careful artistry with her clumsy emergency medical work. Kang went absolutely still under her touch. I ruined it, she whispered. No. His voice was rough, barely controlled. You made it mean something different. Her fingers traced the length of the scar, following the path of her own needlework. She could feel his heartbeat accelerating under her palm. Could feel the tension in his muscles as he fought not to move. Petra. Her name was a warning. She looked up and found his eyes on her, dark and intense and full of something that made her breath catch. I should go, she said, but she didn't move her hand. You should, he agreed, but he caught her wrist, holding her there. Neither of them moved. The dress was black silk and probably cost more than 6 months of Petra's former rent. Kang's men had delivered it to her room with shoes that actually fit and jewelry she was afraid to touch. The note attached said simply, wear this. Tonight you're mine. She should have refused. Should have stayed locked in her guest suite and let Kang attend his underworld gala alone. But 3 weeks of living in his world had taught her something important. In the shadows, perception was everything. And right now, the Black Sun thought she was just some random civilian who'd gotten caught in the crossfire. It was time to make them think otherwise. The Metropolitan Club had been rented out for the evening, transformed into a glittering showcase of old money and new violence. Men in tuxedos mingled with women dripping in diamonds, every smile hiding a knife, every handshake a negotiation. Petra descended the main staircase on Kang's arm and felt every eye in the room turn toward them. You didn't tell me this was a performance, she murmured. Everything is a performance. His hand settled on the small of her back, possessive and protective. Just stay close and let me handle the politics. That lasted exactly 12 minutes. Petra was accepting a champagne flute from a server when a man appeared beside her, his cologne expensive and suffocating. He was older than Kang, maybe mid-40s, with silver threading through his dark hair and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. So you're the famous maid, he said in accented English, his Korean much smoother. The one who saved our Ghost of Wall Street. Petra recognized danger when she saw it. And you are? Park Jin-sung. Black Sun Syndicate. He said it like an introduction at a country club, casual and deadly. I wanted to meet the woman brave enough to involve herself in our business. Across the room, Kang had gone absolutely still, his conversation dying mid-sentence. His men were already moving, forming a perimeter, but Park had brought his own soldiers. The gala crowd sensed the shift in atmosphere and began backing away, creating a circle around Petra and the man who wanted her dead. I wasn't involving myself, Petra said, keeping her voice steady. I was stopping a man from bleeding out in a hotel hallway. That's called basic human decency. That's called choosing sides. Park's smile sharpened. In our world, Miss Thompson, there is no such thing as neutral. You saved Kang's life, which means you cost me a very expensive contract. That creates what we call a debt. Kang reached them in 3 strides, inserting himself between Petra and Park like a human shield. She's under my protection. Of course she is. That's what makes her so valuable. Park's eyes glittered with malice as he looked past Kang to Petra. Enjoy the party, Miss Thompson. We'll be seeing each other again very soon. They didn't speak on the drive back to the mansion. Kang sat rigid in the back of the SUV, staring out the window at the Manhattan skyline like it held answers he couldn't find. Petra watched his reflection in the glass, watched the way his jaw clenched and unclenched, the way his hands formed fists against his thighs. When they arrived, he went straight to his study and poured 3 fingers of whiskey he didn't drink. Petra followed him in and closed the door. You need to leave, he said without turning around. Tomorrow morning. I'll arrange protection, a new identity if necessary. Somewhere the Black Sun can't reach. No. This isn't a negotiation, Petra. You're right. It's not. She crossed the room until she was standing directly behind him, close enough to see the tension in his shoulders. Because I'm not leaving. He turned then, and the look on his face was something she'd never seen before, raw fear bleeding through the cracks in his armor. You heard Park tonight. They know who you are. They know you matter to me. That makes you a target, and I can't. His voice broke. I won't watch another person die because of who I am. So that's it? You're going to ship me off somewhere and go back to being the ghost? Alone and untouchable and slowly dying inside that ice you've built around yourself? It's safer. For who? For me, or for you? Petra stepped closer, forcing him to really look at her. Because I think you're not scared of me dying, Kang. I think you're terrified of letting yourself care whether I live. You don't understand what you're asking. Then explain it to me. Everyone I've ever cared about ends up dead or destroyed. My father. My men. Anyone who gets close to me becomes collateral damage in a war that never ends. His hands came up to grip her shoulders, not rough but desperate. I can survive losing everything else, Petra. I can't survive losing you. The confession hung between them like a sword suspended by thread. Petra reached up and placed her palm against his chest, right over the scar she'd given him, feeling his heart hammering beneath silk and skin and ink. You don't get to make that choice for me. I saved your life once, and I'd do it again. I'll keep doing it, for as long as you'll let me, because that's what you do when you... She didn't finish the sentence. Couldn't finish it, because the truth was too big and too dangerous and she wasn't ready to name it yet. So instead, she kissed him. Kang went rigid for half a heartbeat, shock stealing his breath. Then his arms came around her like a man drowning, pulling her against him with a desperation that spoke of 3 years of ice finally breaking apart. When they separated, foreheads pressed together, Petra whispered, I'm staying. And we're going to war together. The text came from Kang's phone while he was in a meeting with his lieutenants. Petra saw it light up on his desk where he'd left it charging, supplies delivered to storage unit. Gate code 4782. She shouldn't have gone alone. Looking back, she'd realize how perfectly they'd played her, how the household account she'd been using suddenly needed restocking, how the supplier she'd been working with for 3 weeks suddenly suggested the warehouse pickup to save on delivery fees, how natural it all seemed. By the time she realized the storage facility in Red Hook was abandoned, it was too late. The van doors opened and Park Jin-sung stepped out, flanked by 8 men with guns already drawn. Miss Thompson. So good of you to accept my invitation. Petra's hand went to her phone, but one of Park's men was faster, ripping it from her grasp and crushing it under his heel. They zip-tied her wrists and dragged her into the warehouse, a concrete tomb that smelled like rust and old blood. They chained her to a support beam in the center of the empty space and waited. Kang found out 17 minutes later when his head of security checked the mansion cameras and saw Petra leaving alone. He didn't call for backup. Didn't assemble his army. He took one gun, loaded a single magazine, and drove to Red Hook like a man racing toward his own execution. He walked through the warehouse doors alone. 8 guns tracked his movement as he crossed the concrete floor, hands visible, weapon holstered. Park stood behind Petra, one hand resting almost casually on her shoulder, the other holding a knife to her throat. The ghost of Wall Street, Park announced, his voice echoing in the empty space. Finally showing his face. I expected more of a fight. Let her go. Kang's voice was calm, emotionless, the voice of a man negotiating a business transaction. Your issue is with me, not her. My issue is with your entire organization. But I'll admit, using your weakness was easier than I expected. Park's knife pressed closer, and Petra felt the sharp edge break skin. Tell me, Kang. How does it feel to care about something you can't protect? Kang's eyes met Petra's across the distance. She saw something there that made her chest ache, not fear, but apology. He was looking at her like he was memorizing her face, like this was goodbye. Then he smiled, and it was the most dangerous expression she'd ever seen. You made one mistake, Park. What's that? You assumed I came alone. The warehouse lights died. Gunfire erupted in the darkness, muzzle flashes creating strobe light chaos. Petra felt Park's grip loosen as he spun toward the threat, and in that moment, Kang moved. He crossed 30 feet in seconds, his gun barking twice. Park went down. The chains holding Petra shattered under a bullet she never saw coming. Run, Kang commanded, grabbing her hand. They ran. They burst out of the warehouse into the sodium-lit chaos of Red Hook's industrial waterfront, Kang's hand locked around Petra's wrist like iron. Behind them, the building erupted with gunfire. His men had arrived after all, turning Park's trap into a tomb for the Black Sun. This way, Kang pulled her left, away from the main streets where Park's backup would be converging. They ran through alleys that smelled like fish and gasoline, Petra's heels abandoned somewhere in the warehouse, her feet slapping against broken concrete. A black sedan screeched around the corner ahead of them, cutting off their escape. 4 men poured out, weapons raised. Kang shoved Petra behind a dumpster and returned fire with a precision that came from years of survival. 2 men dropped. The other 2 took cover behind their vehicle, and suddenly they were pinned down, trapped between Park's reinforcements ahead and his warehouse soldiers behind. How many bullets do you have left? Petra asked, pressed against his back in the narrow space between dumpster and brick wall. Not enough. She laughed, high and slightly hysterical. This is a terrible time to fall in love with someone. Kang glanced back at her, his face streaked with someone else's blood, his eyes blazing with something that looked like fury and devotion mixed into one dangerous emotion. The worst timing possible. Then he kissed her. It was nothing like the kiss in his study, that had been desperation and confession. This was a promise written in gunpowder and adrenaline, a vow made in the space between heartbeats while the world tried to kill them both. When they broke apart, Kang's radio crackled. Boss, we've got Park. He's requesting terms. Kang pressed the transmitter. No terms. I want every Black Sun lieutenant's location within the hour. Tell Park if he cooperates, his death will be quick. He released the button and turned to Petra, his free hand cupping her face with a gentleness that contradicted everything happening around them. I need you to trust me one more time. What are you going to do? End this. Permanently. His thumb traced her cheekbone, memorizing the curve of her face. No more wars. No more running. After tonight, the Black Sun ceases to exist, and every other syndicate in this city will know that you are untouchable. Kang. I love you. He said it simply, factually, like he was stating the weather. I've probably loved you since you threatened me with a kitchen knife in your apartment. And I will burn this entire city down before I let anyone hurt you again. The sedan's occupants were advancing, using their vehicle for cover. Kang's men were closing in from behind. The alley had become a killing box, and Kang Min-Jae stood at its center with a woman who'd saved his life and stolen his heart. He raised his gun and stepped out of cover. Stay down, he told Petra. This ends now. 6 months later, the mansion in Riverdale looked different in the morning light. Petra stood on the master bedroom balcony, coffee in hand, watching the sun rise over the city that had tried to kill them both. The skyline was the same, but everything else had changed. Behind her, she heard Kang moving through the bedroom, the sound of him getting ready for another day of meetings. Legitimate meetings now, with lawyers and accountants instead of lieutenants and enforcers. The Kang syndicate was going clean, a slow and dangerous transformation that had the entire underworld watching to see if it was possible for a ghost to become human. You're up early, Kang said, stepping onto the balcony beside her. He was dressed for the office, all tailored suits and expensive cologne, but the tattoos still peeked above his collar, a reminder of who he'd been, who he'd always be underneath the legitimate businessman facade. Couldn't sleep. Too much to do. Petra leaned into him as his arm came around her waist. The community center opens next week. The contractors are behind schedule, the permits are still being processed, and I think the city inspector is expecting a bribe I'm not willing to pay. I'll make a call. A legal call. A very legal, very boring call to my very expensive lawyer. He kissed the top of her head. You've built something good, Petra. Your mother would be proud. The Thompson Community Health Center was Petra's legacy, funded by money Kang had been trying to launder anyway and staffed by nurses who understood what it meant to treat people who couldn't afford to be sick. It was everything her mother's hospital bills had taught her the world needed, and everything Petra had never thought she'd have the power to create. Park's lieutenant reached out yesterday, Kang said quietly. The last of the Black Sun remnants. They want to negotiate territory in Queens. What did you tell them? That I don't negotiate with dead men. His voice was cold, the ghost flickering beneath the surface. But I gave them a choice, leave New York or work for me in the legitimate operations. 3 of them took the job offer. Petra turned in his arms to face him, her hands sliding up to rest against his chest where the scar from her amateur stitching marked him forever. You're really doing this. Leaving the shadows. I'm trying. For you. For us. He caught her left hand, his thumb brushing across the diamond ring he'd given her 2 months ago, not in some romantic gesture, but during a quiet dinner when he'd simply said, "Marry me. Be my partner in everything." She'd said yes before he'd finished the sentence. King and Queen, she murmured, remembering the night in the alley when he'd promised to burn the city down for her. Partners, he corrected. In everything. The sun climbed higher, burning away the last of the shadows, and Petra Thompson stood beside Kang Min-Jae knowing that some love stories were written in blood and stitches and second chances, and those were the ones worth saving. Would you risk everything to save a stranger's life, even if it pulled you into a world of danger and forbidden love? Have you ever found yourself drawn to someone you knew you shouldn't want? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you loved Petra and Kang's dangerous love story, hit that like button and subscribe for more dark mafia romances where love is the most dangerous weapon of all. Drop a comment telling me, would you have saved Kang that night in the hotel, or would you have walked away? Every like and share helps us bring you more heart-pounding stories of love born in chaos. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next thrilling romance.